That the greatest composer in music who's probably ever lived was Johann Sebastian Bach. Even the unsaved will admit to that. So yes, we have a right to our own race, language, and culture. We have our own right to live on some place in North America here with our own geographic boundaries, just as every other nation has that right. You say you're intolerant, Brother Eric. Well, I'm just for my own people, because you see, if this continues in this country, if we continue to be amalgamated and assimilated and race mixed and constantly beaten down because we're white, and it's the white man that destroyed the Indian, it's the white man that always persecutes the black, without any distinction of the papal conspiracy involved in using select wicked white men, then it's going to be over. America will ultimately be a nation of color, just like Central America and South America. And when it goes under a nation of color, it will be a military dictatorship ruled by wicked white men for the benefit of wicked white men. And another thing, once we lose white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations, where's the Jew going to go? Where's the Jew going to have a haven to live? They don't live in any black nations that I know of in Africa. If any of you know of one, please let me know. They don't live in the Oriental nations of China, to my knowledge, or Tibet. They don't live in Japan. The largest Jewish populations have lived for the last 500 years in historic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations. And therefore, that is one of the reasons that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations have been so blessed. Do you enjoy traveling on a road in a nice car? That's because of the freedom of conscience championed by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Baptists. Every time you're driving down in your car, you can thank some white man that was a Protestant for it. Every time you turn on a light bulb, you can turn on some white man who was a member of the Protestant nation. Every time you enjoy going out and shooting your gun, you can thank some white man who probably invented it, and some white German who perfected it. So we need to be thankful, and the white race needs to be taken off the chopping block by all these left-wing, socialist, communist, quote-unquote liberals, by the savage blacks, in contradistinction to the civil blacks who are victimized and murdered by the savage blacks, and by anybody else, by the Native American Indians who are going to blame all white men in general for what that Roman Catholic general Philip Sheridan did when he declared war on all the Native American Indians here and said the only good Indian's a dead Indian. Don't blame that on a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's time that we rightly divided history. And it's time that we white men stop being ashamed that we're white. It's time that we stop being ashamed for our white Anglo-Saxon Protestant history. When the British went down into Africa, oh, you can condemn British colonialism all you want. British colonialism brought some civility and law and order to those savage black nations. That's right. And you ask any black in Africa today who knows the past of the 1940s, 50s or so, when the British were still there, they would gladly have the British in conjunction with all this raping, murder, and killing. And that's just what the Jesuits wanted. Get the British out so we can get the blacks warring with one another in their nations and kill one another, just as they're going to do here. So we white men need to begin to rebuild our history, primarily us Protestant and Baptist white men, because our history, we have been robbed of it. They have taken it away from us. They will not teach us in the public schools about the Reformation and what it did. They will not teach us in the public schools how Martin Luther broke the power, the Pope's commercial power, and how Protestant nations stopped paying Peter's pence, that damnable tax that enriched the papacy so it could oppress the peoples that it ruled over. We are not told how the kings of Europe, when the Reformation hit Germany, began to repudiate the temporal power of the Pope and started governing their countries what was best for their own people. Do you know what that's called? That's called nationalism. Biblical nationalism. And the Jesuits hate nationalism. The Jesuits, in their control of history, have blamed World War I and World War II on that damnable institution of nationalism. Nationalism is not what caused World War I. It is not what caused World War II. It was the Jesuits using their high-level Freemasons in several of those countries to foment war in those countries and between those countries. The British didn't want to go to war with the Germans. The German people didn't want to go to war with the Russians. It was their damnable leaders controlled by the papacy that caused it. So no, nationalism is biblical and we should seek to be nationalistic. Bible-believing Christians are not internationalists. We hate internationalism. We repudiate internationalism. We want our own country where we have a unique race. In this country that you go to, you're going to be going to a certain people of a certain race. And this people has a certain language that they speak. And this people has a certain history. And this people has a certain culture. And Protestant nations had a Bible-based culture. You know, when I went into Canada last year, I noticed that at the port there, I noticed the Niagara Falls, where they had this great big beautiful cement stone, and on it was carved the account of the Noachian flood. I thought, they've got Scripture up here. Somebody actually carved Scripture in this wonderful, beautiful monument here in Canada. That's right, you Canadians. You have a biblical, Bible-based history. But oh no, you Canadians have to be beaten down. You have to pay those taxes to support all those Roman Catholics in Quebec. Why don't you let Quebec secede? Why don't you Protestant Canadians agitate for the secession of Quebec and let all those Roman Catholics in Quebec who hate you have their own government and have their own country? Why don't you Protestant Canadians start agitating and saying the Queen of England hates us, the Queen of England wants to destroy our Protestant provinces, and we want our own country. We want British Columbia, which is Protestant, to be our own nation. You say we got all these Chinese there. The Vancouver's loaded with Chinese. Do you know why there's Chinese in China? Why are there so many Chinese in China? Pardon me, why are there so many Chinese in Vancouver? It's because this government in Washington and in London caused the communist revolution, and it brought Mao Zedong to power. And to keep from being murdered and killed, many of those Chinese that are now in Vancouver as well as San Francisco fled for refuge to come here. They didn't want to come here. They were forced to come here by Mao Zedong, that creature of the Pope, who kicked out the Jesuits in 1949 to make it look like he was anti-Jesuit. Wasn't that clever? So yes, we white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people, we need not to be ashamed of the Bible any longer. We need not to be ashamed of our Protestant history any longer, because you know, all we ever wanted was a country to live in where we could disseminate the Bible with one another, have a culture that was based on the Bible, and that men in power who would govern us would believe the Bible. And that would act upon limitations of their wicked, sinful impulses that all of us men have. Well, with that idea, I'd like to go to a quote that was recently emailed to me. And these are two citations from Edmund Burke, whose statue is placed in front of Trinity College in Dublin. And he placed his finger on the cause and condition of our country now in these statements from before 1800. Now, Edmund Burke was one of the greatest statesmen that ever graced Britain. I love his writings. I love his speeches. He was against the British kings, King George III, wanting to keep the colonies subject to the crown. He was for the American Revolution. Edmund Burke had an extant amount of wisdom and knowledge. So let's read what he said. Quote, "Nothing ought to be more weighed than the nature of books recommended by public authority. So recommended, they soon form the character of the age. Uncertain indeed is the efficacy. Limited indeed is the extent. of a